think it's probably fair to say that as landscape photographers, most of us prefer to spend our time outside in the field taking images, to spending our time sat at a computer editing. However, the editing process is really an integral part of the art of photography, and it's important, I think, for us to try and develop our own workflows and our own way of editing images, so that we can try and bring our own style to our photography. I've been asked several times over the last few months what my own approach to editing images is, and so I think it's a little overdue for me to produce a video really just walking through my own post-processing workflow. In this video, I'm going to be editing a photograph which I took when I was in Mount Cook National Park in New Zealand. And the reason I've chosen this image is because I guess it's kind of a typical mountain photograph I would take, and a lot of the editing processes which I'll apply to this image are fairly general to the sorts of processes that I would apply to many of my images. I do think it's important though to understand that when editing images it's best not to take a painting by numbers approach. Every image should be treated slightly differently, and every image will require different processes to create the image or the art that we want to create. For that reason, I think that it's important to understand that although this is how I've edited this image, this isn't necessarily how I would edit every image. However, there are general principles that I would go through generally in my workflow, and I think this is a good image to demonstrate those processes. For my own editing process, I tend to prefer using a combination of Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom. I'll generally start off in Lightroom where I'll make more global changes, before then transferring the image into Photoshop where I'll make more local changes. Of course, there's a lot of crossover between those two applications, and a lot of what you can do in Lightroom, for example, you can also do in Photoshop. I know many people prefer to use either one or the other, but for me personally, the workflow that I've developed over the last few years has really involved a combination of both pieces of software. I also think that it's important to know that Adobe Lightroom will do things slightly differently, or does processes slightly differently to how processes are done in Photoshop. If you'd like to know more about that, I'd really recommend that you go and check out Alex Nail's channel, because Alex has been putting some videos together recently explaining the processes that underlie the sliders in Lightroom. For my day job, I'm actually a scientist, and so I think it's fair to say I'm a little bit of a geek, and I've actually been really enjoying those videos that Alex has been making. So if that's something that would interest you as well, definitely go and check out his channel. So this is the image opened up in Lightroom, and this is with no edits at all in it. So the first thing I'll normally do when editing an image, the first stage is normally to click these lens corrections. I'll do remove chromatic aberration, and then I'll also, more times than not, normally I'll apply profile corrections as well. So this is essentially adjusting any distortion that's been caused by a particular lens that you've used. In this case, however, I think I'll leave that unticked, because actually I think I prefer the image without those profile corrections. It's always worth just checking both options and just going for the one which you prefer. It might be that you want to keep some of those lens profiles. The next thing which I'll normally do when editing an image is crop it, and in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a 16:9 crop. The reason I want to do that for this image is I feel like the main interest of the image really is this band of orange light that's coming in from the left hand side and illuminating those mountains. And without that 16:9 crop, if I set it back to the original, you can see there's an awful lot of sky up here in the image, which I think is actually just distracting from the image. So I'm going to try and cut that out by just applying a 16:9 crop. And then this is also normally the point where a lot of the composition of the image will come into play. So here, when I'm applying this crop, you can see you've got this grid, which is the rule of thirds, and I'm just going to adjust this slightly so the bottom of the mountains are sitting along the lower third. I've got this little peak here, which is on the left-hand third, and then the curve of the river is coming up to the right-hand third as well. You can see it's just about touching that right-hand third, and I think that actually works pretty well. There's no sort of big straight horizon in this image that I need to worry about getting dead on horizontal, but actually it looks like I've had the tripod pretty well leveled when I took this image anyway. It doesn't look like I need to adjust the rotation at all, so I'm just going to go ahead and crop the image there. The next thing I'll start to do is work my way down these sliders, and I'll tend to do these and pretty much the order in which they're presented. Lightroom has basically provided the sliders in this order as quite a useful way of working through the image. So the first thing I would normally do at this point is check for white balance. For me, as I say, I feel like the main sort of focus of this image is this band of golden light. So I'm just going to enhance that slightly just by pushing up the white balance, only very subtly. And I tend, for most of these adjustments, I tend to prefer just being on the cautious side and doing things subtly. I'm not going to start doing drastic changes like this. I'm just going to push it ever so slightly to the warmth. I might just sort of warm it up and then dial it back a little bit to sort of see where I quite like it. I think probably around about here is pretty good. The next thing I'll do is adjust the exposure. You can see that I've got my histogram here is quite balanced over onto the left hand side. I think a lot of people can be a little bit too over obsessed with a histogram and wanting to have it spread out evenly. I find that's not always the best approach. I tend really to first of all look at the image and see what I like about the image, and then adjust things accordingly according to how the actual image looks, rather than focusing too much on the histogram. For me, this is a dark and moody image. That's the sort of feel I want it to have. So I'm not too worried about that histogram being skewed over to the left. But I do think that some of these dark areas are probably a little bit too dark, so I might in this case just ever so slightly boost the exposure. And then what I'll do is I'll start to bring in some of that contrast a little bit more. I can use the contrast slider here. To be honest, I tend to prefer adding contrast using the curves as opposed to the contrast slider. This contrast slider tends to boost saturation as well at the same time. So I might just add a very subtle addition of contrast here using this slider, but I think most of the contrast in this image is going to come out of using the curves feature. The next thing I would do, usually to pretty much every image of landscapes, but not always, but a lot of the time, is I'll drop the highlights just to bring some of the brightness of that sky down a little bit. And then I will boost the shadows slightly. As I say though, I want to keep these shadows fairly dark. I don't want a nice even histogram in this image, because if I just show you what that will look like, if I sort of even out the histogram, it will look more like this, and that's really, for me, the image has just kind of lost that feel which I want. So I'm not going to do that. We'll keep that down. We'll keep the histogram skewed to the left hand side. But the shadows I will just boost slightly, just so that there aren't any areas which are too dark. But I also don't want to boost the shadows too much either, because I don't think that that's really necessary here. The next thing I'll do generally is I will check for white point and the black point. I tend to set the black point pretty close to black, so in a mountain scene like this, I would normally assume that there may be some small areas of actual true black in the image. So what I'll do is I will, on a Mac, if you press Option when you adjust these sliders, it will just show you areas of true black. So if I was to drop that black slider right down, you can see all these areas here would be appearing as true black. What I would do is I normally bring that slider back up until there's maybe only just 1 or 2 points that are showing up as black. You won't always want to set that right down, because there may not actually be black in your image. But certainly for a mountain scene like this, I quite like having that black point set so that there's 1 or 2 areas of actual black in the image, but nothing that's really clipping. You can also check the histogram here, just check these 2 little triangles in the top to make sure you're not clipping anything. Whites, again, there may not be areas in your image that are true white. Certainly in this image, the whitest parts are these areas of snow up here. They're actually yellow in this image, really, they're not really white. So what I do is I'll boost the whites up until I can see whether I'm clipping or not, and then I'll start to bring it back down, just visually, ignoring the histogram in the top. I'll just bring it back down until visually it's looking about right. The other thing which I'm going to do at this stage is I'm just feeling that the sky is just a little bit too bright. I want to bring those clouds down a little bit, make it a little bit more, gloomy and oppressive, really to try and capture that kind of gloomy, cloudy, oppressive feeling that we had going on in the morning when I took this photograph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a grad filter, and this, I'm just going to set everything back down here to nothing. I'm just going to drop the exposure down, about half a stop or so down maybe, something like that. And also the highlights here, I just drop even further. Now, for where I've got this grad positioned, you can see I'm just hitting that snow slightly. So I'm just going to bring it back up a little bit so that it's not really affecting that snowy area. It's really just affecting the top area of this sky, and then you can just adjust the gradient of how that grad filter is changing from dark to light. And here I want quite a soft edge effectively on that grad filter. Something like that is pretty much ideal. So I've still got this brightness here of light that's coming in from the left hand side, but it's just toned that top bit down there a little bit. So the next thing I'm going to do here now, I think, is just add a bit of an S-curve. So what an S-curve is doing in the curves adjustment is it's essentially enhancing the contrast of the image. So for this darks area here, I'll just drop those down a little bit. And this is what I mean by, I find that adding an S-curve tends to be a better way of adding contrast than using the contrast slider. You can just be a little bit more accurate and selective about where that contrast is being boosted. And you can see that that S-curve has just, if I take that curve off, you can see how that's really just sort of boosted the contrast in quite a nice way, I feel. So the next thing which I'll do is I may do some colour adjustments. I tend not to do very much in terms of colour adjustments because that's where I feel you can start to get just a little bit too carried away sometimes. You know, for me, as I said at the start, I very much want to keep my images looking as natural as I can, and as soon as you start doing colour grading and adjusting colour sliders, it can just start to look a little bit artificial if you're not careful. So I'm always very careful about colour adjustments. And actually on that point, I just want to say I tend not to do very much with vibrance and saturation either. Vibrance, sometimes I might just boost slightly, so I just boost it up to maybe 6, something like that, just to try and increase the vibrance of these light areas where the sky is coming, where we've got these bands of yellow light coming across, but I don't think I want to do any more than that. And certainly I tend not to boost saturation at all. It's just not my style of photography. I'm not a big fan of increasing saturation in these images. Here again, what I might do is just bring up the warm tones slightly using this colour grading tool, just to kind of highlight, I guess, these warm tones that we've got going on in the light. It's very subtle. You can just see that's very, very subtle, ever so subtle. You can see it's just warmed up these areas here in the sky. That's all that's done. It's just warmed that up slightly in these brighter areas. You can actually adjust with these new curves. You can adjust kind of the brightness of those particular areas. It's actually quite useful, this tool. It's taken me a little while to get used to this new colour grading tool in Lightroom. It is quite useful once you get the hang of it, but it can be easy to overdo things with it as well, so I do tend to try and be very subtle with any changes that I make using that panel. The only other thing that's standing out for me here a little bit is I feel like some of those blues maybe need to come down a little bit. If I just drop the saturation of the blue ever so slightly, you can see, I think that just helps. There's this little bit of blue up here in the sky. It's also affecting the river here as well. I'm just going to drop that blue saturation slightly. There's still a certain, for those of you who are into colour theory, you can see this image has got a little bit of natural teal and orange going on in it. I don't want to boost that too much because I just feel like sometimes when you start to boost these colours, for me it just feels like there's a bit of an artificial kind of feel about them sometimes. For me, I just want to try and keep these images looking as natural as I can, really. So that's almost it now, really, for what I would do in Lightroom. Sharpening, I don't touch the sharpening tool in Lightroom at all. I'm not a big fan of the way that Lightroom applies sharpening. So the other thing as well is I will not touch the clarity slider. Again, I don't like the way the clarity slider in Lightroom works. I don't feel that it does a very good job, really, of boosting clarity. So I tend, if anything, I will drop the clarity, but again, I tend not to boost clarity much in Lightroom ever, really, on my images. The only other thing which I might do here is just add a slight bit of a vignette. I tend to do more vignette adjustments, really, in Photoshop than I do in Lightroom, but sometimes I will just add a little bit of a vignette. In this case, I'll bring that midpoint in a little bit. Quite often when I'm making slider adjustments in Lightroom, what I'll do is I'll overdo it and then I'll dial it back to the point where I'm happy with it. So here, I think that's pretty good. So I think that's all of the adjustments I need to do now in Lightroom. So I'm going to move this over into Photoshop. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll right click it, I'll go to Editing and Edit in Photoshop. Okay, so this is the image now opened up in Photoshop, and I suppose the first thing that I should mention is that when I'm doing my edits in Photoshop, I use this plugin. It's called TK Actions. It's actually a plugin. You do have to purchase it. It's about £30, I think, normally. I'm not sponsored by TK Actions, by the way, but it's something which I use all the time when I'm editing in Photoshop. It just makes my workflow an awful lot easier. It's designed for generating luminosity masks. I don't really have time to go into luminosity masks in detail in this video. You don't need to have this plugin. Everything that this plugin does you can really do anyway in Photoshop, but it just speeds up the process an awful lot. And there are other plugins like this available. I would recommend actually that maybe you go and check out some of the videos by Nick Page on comparing the different tools that you can use for generating luminosity masks, but the one which I prefer is this one, TK Actions. So if you wonder what these buttons are, that's what they are, but they essentially, each of these buttons triggers an action, so it's a sort of shortcut really for doing certain processes in Photoshop. So the first thing which I will do actually normally in Photoshop is I will delete any dust that's appearing in the image. I don't have too many dust spots in this image. There's a couple up here in the sky, but yeah, you can do your dust deletion in Lightroom. I prefer to use the heal tool here in Photoshop for doing it, and actually TK Actions has got this button here. If you press that, then it actually creates a couple of layers which enhance the contrast and make some of those dust spots easier to see. So what I'll do is I'll normally work around the image here. I've got this heal tool selected, and I'll just find any areas like this. This could actually be a bit of a cloud actually, but it looks a little bit like a dust spot, so just to be on the safe side I'll just correct that. This here is certainly a dust spot, so I'll just correct that. The other thing which I've got here, it looks like there's a track or something here. It's just creating a little bit of a distraction, so I'll just remove that. One of the things which I like to do is a sort of squint test. So if I sort of look at the image and squint, if there's anything that sort of throws itself out as being a particular distraction that I want to get rid of, this is often the stage where I will get rid of those distractions. So using the heal tool is what I'll normally do for deleting dust and removing distractions, and I'll also have that set to content aware for doing that. And I do this on a separate layer in Photoshop, and I'll have sample all layers selected so that basically any changes that I do in Photoshop are non-destructive because I do everything on a separate layer. So I'll always keep the base edit as my background layer in Photoshop and then build up layers of edits over the top of that, so I can always go back and change things if I decide that I've gone too far with a particular edit. The next thing I would tend to do after doing my dust deletion is I will do my sharpening. So the technique, again, in this video I just want to provide an overview of my workflow, so I'm not going to go into too many details of how the processes that I use work, but suffice to say that I prefer to do any sharpening in Photoshop using a high pass filter, and I find this works a lot better. In my opinion, it looks a lot more natural than trying to do it in Lightroom. And it also, what I like to do in Photoshop is just apply that sharpening very locally to specific parts of the image rather than applying it to the whole image. So what I'll do to do this is I'll create a duplicate layer of my background. So I've got two versions of the same image. Then what I'll do is I go to Filter, High Pass Filter, and so I'll set this radius to 1.7 for this particular image. That's really the maximum amount that I would ever really set it to. And then what I'll do is I will adjust the blend mode to overlay. So if I zoom in on this section here, you can see how this has sharpened these rocks. That's the layer hidden, and then I've applied that sharpening using a high pass filter, and you can see how it just brings out the sharpening. The other thing, of course, when you sharpen things, what it does is it enhances any noise that's in your image. You can see all this sort of sky has got a lot of noise in it, so that's why I think it's important to just do this locally. So the next thing I'll do is I will apply a layer mask to that layer just to hide the sharpening layer, and then what I'll do using a paintbrush, and I'll set that to white and opacity 100, and then on my layer mask what I'll do is I'll just start to paint in that sharpening just on the areas where I want it. So now it's not appearing in the sky here, it's only appearing on these little areas of rocks where I want to apply sharpening. And so I will do that literally just in these points where I want to just apply a little bit of sharpening, and I want to be fairly subtle about it. So it's really just these areas here where we've got a few little rocks which I think just need to be sharpened ever so slightly. The next thing which I will do is apply the levels. Now the levels here, this is where I'll normally again just check the black point and the white point. So the next thing that I will tend to do is I'll do some curves adjustments using luminosity masks. Now again, this subject's quite complicated, and I think in the scope of this video I don't really have time to go into the detail of what luminosity masks are. For this video I'm just providing an oversight of my own process so that you can see what I'm doing. If you're interested in learning more about luminosity masks and you'd like me to do some more detailed videos on this, then do let me know in the comment section below. There are plenty of fantastic videos out there describing what luminosity masks are, so I would also particularly have a look at Nick Page's videos because he's got some really fantastic ones explaining the ins and outs of luminosity masks, and it was those that I used to learn the use of these. So the first thing I'll do probably is I'll select a lights luminosity mask. So this is essentially what a luminosity mask is it will apply a mask to an adjustment layer in Photoshop, and that mask will be essentially a black and white version of your image. So a lights will be a sort of standard black and white version of your image. A darks will be an inverted black and white version of your image. And if you understand the concept of masks, so essentially when you apply a mask to a layer, white areas will let your adjustments come through and black areas will hide those adjustments. Then when you do a luminosity mask, it allows you to selectively apply your adjustments to areas of your image based purely on their luminosity values. So for instance, if I wanted to darken the lights, what I'll do is I'll apply a lights luminosity mask and then adjust curves. So what this has done is it's created a curves adjustment layer with a lights luminosity mask on it. So now when I adjust my curves, you can see that it's just doing those lighter areas. It might be that you want to boost those lighter areas, of course, and I think that's probably what I'm going to do in this image, just ever so slightly, just a very subtle boost of those lighter areas. Essentially, I'm increasing the contrast again here. You can see that's just boosting those areas ever so slightly. The other thing that I'll do, if I've made an adjustment in Photoshop on a layer and I think actually maybe that's a little bit too much, what I might do is just dial back the opacity slightly. Here, what I'm looking at is this area of snow here. I just feel like I'm boosting the lights a bit too much there, so I'm just going to bring the opacity down slightly. So the next thing I'm going to do is kind of the reverse of that. This time I'm going to go for a darks luminosity mask. With the TK Actions panel, you can select either all of the darks or you can go in for just the darkest levels here. I'm probably going to go for like a darks 3, something like that. So I'm just adjusting the darker tones of the image, and again I'll go for a curves adjustment. And you can see these tones showing up in a histogram. These are the only ones in the image that are going to be adjusted here. So if I just drop that, you can see it's just affecting the lower, the darker tones of the image. It's not affecting the lighter tones, and that's what these luminosity masks enable you to do, is to very selectively select certain tones in your image and make adjustments to them. So you can see that's just darkened those slightly. I think it's probably a little bit too much, so again I'm just going to drop that opacity slightly, and something about there I think is pretty good. Now I think we're almost there. The only thing that you might want to do is maybe do a little bit of dodging and burning. Now again, I use luminosity masks when I'm dodging and burning my images. In this case, I just want to brighten this sort of valley floor here where we've got this river running through. I don't want to brighten this area, it's just this kind of area where the actual river is sitting. So I'm going to very subtly apply a slight bit of dodging to that area. So to do that, what I'll do is I will create a dodge layer, and I will apply a Lights 1 luminosity mask to that layer. So in this case I find that using luminosity masks in this way acts as a kind of a stencil. So it means that you're just applying your adjustments to the lighter sort of areas of your image based on the luminosity, and it just makes things look an awful lot more natural than if you were to do it without a luminosity mask. So maybe if I just show you quickly what I mean by that. If I have a dodge layer here without a luminosity mask applied to it, and I do some dodging, let's drop the opacity down to say 23%, and I'm just using a soft edge brush. Everything I do in Photoshop, by the way, I always use a soft edge brush. And so what I can do is I can just sort of dodge this area like this, and it looks okay. It doesn't look too bad. But what it's doing is it's a very kind of, I guess, crude way of doing things. If I was to do the same thing with a luminosity mask applied to it, what this does is it effectively acts as a stencil. So it's only going to apply those adjustments to the brighter areas, and it just, I feel, just gives it a much more natural feel. I'll just boost the opacity of that slightly, and it just looks a little bit more natural. So now if I do a before and after, so that's it done with a luminosity mask, and that's it done without. And I just feel you can see that it's just brightened that whole area when I've done it without the luminosity mask, and when I've used the luminosity mask it's only really affecting these brighter areas of the image. And I think that just works a lot better and just looks a bit more natural. Again, I feel like I brightened this orange area a little bit too much, so I'm just going to bring that opacity down a little bit. And so I think I'm almost there. This is almost complete now, this image. I think the one final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a vignette. Now you remember I added a slight bit of a vignette back in Lightroom. Again, using the TK Actions panel, it works slightly differently when you're adding a vignette this time. This time it's doing it using a curves adjustment layer and a mask, so that it's just affecting those corners. And I'll normally set the radius of this vignette to 500, which makes quite a sort of soft edge vignette. And then I'll drop the opacity of that vignette layer down a little bit. Normally what I'll do is I'll drop it right down so that the vignette's not there, and then I'll start to increase it until the vignette becomes visible, and then I'll just start to dial it back a little bit. This is how I do a lot of my adjustments, is I'll go a little bit too far with my slider adjustment, and then I'll dial it back a bit until it becomes less noticeable. And that's how I like to try and keep these adjustments fairly subtle. So that's it. I think that's my image now complete. I'm pretty happy with that final edit. This is the point now where I would then save the image. I won't go into my sort of filing systems and how I save images, but normally what I'll do is I'll save a high-res TIFF version of the image that's flat with no layers. I'll also save a version of the image that's got all these adjustment layers in it, so that if I want to I can go back at a later date and see how I've edited the image, or make slight adjustments if I've decided I didn't like the way I did something. And then I'll also normally do a low-res JPEG save of the image, which I'll save as an sRGB file, which will then be used either for my YouTube videos or posting onto social media. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. Like I said, I'm sorry I've not really had time to go into a huge amount of detail of some of the specific steps that I've taken in this post-processing process. If there's anything that you'd like me to go into more depth on in future videos, then please do let me know in the comments below.